The Vikings signed a cornerback, and I'm pretty excited about him. Let's talk about it on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. You can also find the show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. This is a very fun time. We are still in, as I am recording this, we are still technically in the pre-negotiating window. It ends Wednesday at noon, or at 3 Central, right? That's when the league year officially turns over. Contracts can be officialized. Teams have to be cap compliant. You're no longer projected to be over or under the cap. You just can't be over the cap. The Vikings, I think, have solved that problem. I think they will be good to go. I'll explain a little bit about their cap situation later because we have so much more than Byron Murphy to talk about. I will get to him first, but we also have Garrett Bradbury. We've got a couple specialists. Kirk Cousins did a big restructure on his deal. We'll go over what all of that means for the Vikings. But first things first, this Byron Murphy signing is probably going to be the one that has the most impact. I think this is the big signing of the offseason. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. He's got a lot of tricks left up his sleeve, I'm sure. But signing Byron Murphy, cornerback formerly of the Arizona Cardinals, is awesome. I am super stoked on Byron Murphy. Now, I will be perfectly upfront. I have a lot to learn about him yet. So, grain of salt, this is all instant reaction stuff. And as I learn more, obviously, my opinion will evolve and change and hopefully be a little bit more substantial. But from what I know about Byron Murphy, I think he is a great fit. I think he's just a good player. I think maybe a little bit of an underrated player. And I think the Vikings are buying into him at a time where the price is deflated for reasons that may not affect him moving forward, which just means you're getting a discount. And that's awesome. But Byron Murphy, the player, I think he's a little up and down. It's a little inconsistent, but I think the downs are just kind of like below average and the ups are awesome. But the downs aren't, oh my God, he's the worst corner in the world some days. It's like, some days he's kind of just like meh, and other days he's really, really great. And so the ceiling and the floor are both really nice for ceilings and for floors. That's a very nebulous way to put it. In a less nebulous terms, here's what I see with Byron Murphy. I see a very physical corner. I see a corner that can press, that can play man, that has very, very dope technique. I want to watch a little more about him before I really go too deep into it. But from the few clips that I have really paid attention to between his signing and recording this so far, the way his feet move is really tight. And I don't mean tight as in like tightly wound. I mean tight as in like polished, no wasted movement, and very, very quick. He plays inside and outside. That's a question a lot of people ask. He's like 5'11", 190. That's his size, which will play as an outside corner. That's good enough. But I think anytime you see like the 5 in front of someone, you go, that's a nickel. And I don't think so. I think 5'10", you start to flirt with it, but 5'11", that'll play. And 190 is plenty big. The inside outside, I guess, flexibility is more that he just has more experience inside than most outside corners. But for Arizona, and here's the interesting thing about him, coming out of Washington, he was supposed to be an inside corner, and he was a press bail corner. He was a University of Washington corner. And if you remember all the talk about Kyler Gordon and Trent McDuffie last year, kind of the same thing about Byron Murphy coming out, that they were bail corners and bail corners, that's fine, right? That's just a style. Christian Gonzalez is a bail corner. He might be the first one off the board. But it's just like, if you aren't running that kind of defense, you have to sort of factor that in. Very cover 3, very that's the thing they do. And he was that, and he ended up playing inside man coverage in Arizona. It was a very weird fit. His rookie year was a big struggle. And then I think as time went on, he really kind of grew into that role. And I would call him a man corner more than a zone corner now. And because he played inside a lot to start at Arizona, then Patrick Peterson had a suspension in his rookie year, so he actually had to play outside a little bit more. That was the year Patrick Peterson had his PED suspension. Then Peterson leaves entirely, becomes a Viking. Byron Murphy takes over for him outside, and he just became kind of CB1 and grew into that role. He shadowed inside, shadowed outside, left, right, boundary, field, whatever. Shadowed DK Metcalf, shadowed Devontae Adams, and I think it was week 2 against the Raiders. And did admirably there. He's one of the only corners that really saw success against Cooper Kupp and the Rams in 2021 during like the Cooper Kupp year, right? That was the big year for him. And Byron Murphy was one of the only corners that didn't just get like totally shredded all day long and let Cooper Kupp, put up 120 yards. He's got great. He's also got worse moments, right? He's got a game against the Seahawks this year that I guess wasn't so good that I'm going to go watch, see what kind of went wrong. And so I want to circle back to Byron Murphy and say, okay, let's get a more like almost a draft scout profile of who he is now and how that sort of fits in with Brian Flores. But if he can play man, he fits with Brian Flores. And my understanding is that he can play man, he can play inside, he can play outside, he can be a shadow corner if you wanted him to. I think Byron Murphy will be CB1. I'd be surprised if they got a guy that like is a better corner than him. I don't know if there is one on the market right now. Maybe like Jonathan Jones would have been, but he went back to New England. And people might disagree with me on that too. But and like you're not going to have a rookie be over him. So I think Byron Murphy is your CB1, and I'm personally pretty happy with that. I think that'll play as a cornerback, and so it brings the room kind of out of that DEFCON emergency I've been talking about. It's still a need, I mean, they still have, even if you have Andrew Booth and a Caleb Evans and you feel good about both of those guys, neither of those guys are nickels. Like they don't really play in the slot very much. So I guess you'd have like, if you had to play a game tomorrow, you'd have like Byron Murphy playing in the slot, and that wouldn't be particularly efficient. And those guys are total, uncertainties, right? So we definitely need to keep filling out that room. I think they could use a nickel or use another corner that can play both, and then you just have those guys switch off. And I think they could use a third corner acquisition, be it a rookie or somebody, and then maybe Booth and Evans, they can all get into camp and compete. But I want those guys competing with someone and not just waltzing in and getting a job. And I think most people agree with that. He signed a deal. This is the other thing, the contract details. He signs for 2 years, $22 million. That's pretty small, to be honest. I don't know anything about the structure, but that's 11 million average. And that's like a pretty small average. And usually contracts are like the reported contract numbers are higher than what the cap hits are like actually going to be and the money the player's actually going to see. So if it's even smaller than that in like reality, though, that's like really low. Which is kind of surprising. And the deal with it is Byron Murphy had a back injury last year that I think totally screwed up his stock. It's also, I should say, Brad Spielberger did his PFF free agency thing, and he projected a 12 million average per year. He's getting 11 million average per year. So it's not crazy. That was like a little lower than the expectation, right? But that back injury, and I don't know the nature of it. They were very vague about it. He suffers in like week 9-ish. They're answering questions about it for weeks and weeks, and they go, I don't know. We don't know the timetable. We don't know what's going on, or it wasn't, we're gonna just like shut him down immediately. It wasn't IR and surgery. It was, well, we hope to have him back, but we don't really know the timetable. We're just letting it play out. And then the Cardinals season goes belly up and they shut him down by week 13, put him on IR. So there was like this 4 or 5 week period where it felt like if the Cardinals were playing relevant football, maybe he could have come back. But instead, he now has missed the back half of a season with a back injury and went on IR. And that package of things looks really, really scary. I think that depressed his value a little bit. And so I think the Vikings get a little bit of a discount. And that seems to be sort of the trend with all of the signings the Vikings have had, that they've all had weird injury issues that have made them perhaps less valuable on the market than they will be on the field. But also, like, there's kind of a reason for that. There's risks in ways that kind of thing can totally bite you. And those are the sort of hedged bets that Kwesi is making. He's definitely a markets guy. I don't want to get too into economics because I'll just ramble about that, and then we won't be able to talk about everything else that we have to talk about. But you know what? Put a pin in it, because being the econ guy, I can see how it's working and how it's really all about playing markets. And it's very, very, very fascinating. We still have to talk about Cousins. We still have to talk about Bradbury and explain everything that's going on with the team right now. So we don't have time for that conversation, even though it would be fun. We do have time, however, to talk a little bit about Grambling. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It is March Madness season. You're all filling out your brackets. And here is a tip, all right? Go when you're filling out your brackets, unless you're like really into college basketball and you actually have takes on like Colgate and Oral Roberts. I don't, but I still wanted to do a bracket, right? I don't know how good Michigan State is, but I went to FanDuel and I just looked up the odds, and the odds, not necessarily the point spreads, because they'll all be fairly similar. You know, a 7 will have about a 2.5 point advantage over a 10, and that's kind of there. Any outliers like that is usually where I like try to put my upsets. But if you look at the actual betting odds, if it's plus 100 or minus 120 or whatever, if it's like minus 120, that means people are betting it a lot. And so the book is deflating the payout of it, because the money's hitting that really hard, and it tells you where people are, where the sharps are, and can help you fill out your bracket that way. That helped me out a bunch, and you can go do that just on the sports book without signing up. But if you wanted to sign up, you can get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back, even if your first bet doesn't work out. And you can bet on those college basketball games or XFL or hockey or whatever. Once again, that is a no sweat first bet. All you got to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up, and get that no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. Make every moment more at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Thanks again for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, go check me out on Patreon. Patreon.com/LukeBraun NFL. You can go watch a video with Beans where I explain how the salary cap works. Not unlike one that I put on social media on Tuesday that you may have seen about Kirk Cousins' contract, which we will get to. You can also find, I'll probably do something on some of the free agents too. Garrett Bradbury, though, that's the next probably big one. The Vikings, we didn't know what they were going to do at center. And Garrett Bradbury got a second contract. I'm so sorry. I got to admit, I was wrong. I finally can admit that my take on Garrett Bradbury for the last 4 years was incorrect. I was simply too low on him. I didn't think he'd get a second contract, but he did. And if I was too low on him, well, everybody else, you have repenting to do. I'm kidding. I got really frustrated with the Bradbury discourse throughout his rookie contract, because I think at a certain point, people stopped wanting to actually observe him. And I think it was just kind of look up a PFF grade and get mad or don't get mad accordingly. And I just got kind of frustrated with how little nuance there was to a position like center, where you do have to be a little bit careful about what's whose fault. But here's the deal. Garrett Bradbury is going to be the starting center again. He signs a deal, $15.75 million over 3 years. So a little more than $5 million a year average. Again, I don't know the structure of that, so we'll see how real it is. If there's a fake third year kind of thing, like with Josh Oliver's contract, all of that matters too. The center market is a little bit lower than everybody thought. They're all getting kind of $5-6 million a year when it seemed like they were maybe going to get $7-8 million a year. That's very interesting. And I think maybe it's just a matter of like scarcity, or I guess the lack thereof, that there were just a lot of centers on the market that were all in a very similar tier of play. And so it was all kind of, well, I'm not going to pay you a ton because I can just get the same thing with that guy and pay him less. And they all kind of worked against each other just by availability in that way. But Garrett Bradbury got to technically test the market. I mean, he did get signed before the league year truly turned over, but he got to go negotiate, and then he came back. That's kind of the way that I thought that had to work out if it was going to happen. And it did. that means that the Vikings are going to return all 5 starting offensive linemen, assuming Ed Ingram doesn't like lose a camp battle to Chris Reed or something, which is not impossible. That's very interesting. I think the interior offensive line had a really bad playoff game, but otherwise, I think the O-line was fine over the course of the season. And I think that playoff game might be leaving a bitter taste in your mouth, and you might be a little bit lower on that line than I think is appropriate. Not that there isn't room for improvement on it, though. I do think that bringing all 5 of the same guys back, I'm not going to yell at you for critiquing it, but I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world. And I still do think that competition for Ed Ingram, even if it's a 4th round pick or something, or 5th round guy, or Chris Reed, is still totally fine. I think you can make him win his job, I guess, in camp. Although I do think that I like what Ingram did in the back half of the year. I think he played a little better. So I think this could work out, and a continuity has a lot of impact on offensive line. That's one of the position groups where keeping everybody the same, keeping everything the same as it was last year can actually be really, really valuable. So we'll see how it all plays out. But you can kind of think of Bradbury as very much a bargain option at center. They are not breaking the bank to go out and get the best center. They're not drafting that gopher dude in the first round to throw a first round pick at it, get it solved. Nah, they're saying we'll get the $5 million guy and we'll kind of take what we get with that. Elsewhere on the Vikings roster, I do want to get to the Kirk Cousins restructure. That'll be kind of the thing we wrap up with. But there are other things. I guess I should mention Kenny Willekes returned. He was a restricted free agent, but I don't think they tendered him. I think they just agreed to some terms with him and nobody beat it. Which probably means he's lower than the original round tender, which would be like $2 or $3 million or something. That's like too much for Kenny Willekes. I always like Willekes' odds to make the team. I feel like he's a guy that like can fight his way onto the roster, but certainly not something that's going to define the offseason. And then the specialists, they bring back Andrew DePaola. They sign a 3-year deal, $4 million total value. I love it, man. There is evidence out there. I know PFF tracks like long snap accuracy. I think that's the only organization I know that does that. And he had like 4 misses all year or something, which led the league. And he makes all pro. He was their highest graded long snapper, which I'm sure is very highly correlated to that accuracy thing. There's a decent amount of evidence there to say that the Vikings just locked up the best long snapper in the league. And you're not saying that with a shred of irony. He's just the best one. Go to Andrew DePaola. His story is so cool. I have told it before on this show. I think 2 off seasons ago, or maybe 1 off season ago. But we're gonna tell it again later this summer. I'm so happy about that. I am not as happy about Greg Joseph. Greg Joseph also re-signed for a 1-year deal. I think it's like $2 million or less than $2 million, maybe, or maybe that was his deal before. And I'm just kind of assuming he'll get the same money. But that is, I really hope that they get competition for him. Here's the thing, about Greg Joseph, and he had like 5 game-winning kicks last year. He made the longest kick in Vikings history last year. He etched his name in a couple of record books. But on the whole, if you count extra points as 33-yard field goals, and we don't really have any evidence that suggests that you shouldn't do that. They basically are 33. I mean, this is functionally the same kick, right? It's just worth less points. If you count those as 33-yard field goals, Greg Joseph was a bottom 5 kicker. If you don't count extra points at all, I think he was like an average kicker. He might still be one of the lesser kickers, like a below average kicker. If you remove the extra point issues that he had, which was probably the most glaring issue, he's still just below average. I'm sorry, man. Greg Joseph did bad. I know that the clutch kicks happened and he made all of those like at the end where you really remember him, but the whole body of work, it was bad and we brought him back and I don't like it. At the same time, kicking tends to regress to the mean. Kicking is a lot like golf. And I've used this like analogy on the show before. It's like a lot like it's got that same kind of, it's as mental as it is biomechanical. The biomechanics are very similar. It is a lot like golf. And when you make 45 kicks in a season and judge yourself on that, it's like playing 9 holes of golf and like that being the PGA tournament cut. Like it would be ridiculous, right? The sample is just not big enough. So grain of salt with all of this stuff, but that was not a year that I think warranted being anointed the job. And I would be annoyed if they don't bring in somebody for him to beat. And if they, bring in some undrafted kid, what was his name? Gabe Bursick, and, cut him before camp even opens and say, it was a competition. I want a real competition. I think Greg Joseph should have to earn his job. And I would not have been bothered at all if they brought somebody else instead. So I'm not a huge fan of that move. But the one move that I think everybody's got opinions on is Kirk Cousins. He takes a restructure that saves the Vikings $16 million cap, and I will explain to you exactly how all that stuff works in just a moment. But before I do that, look, if you have opinions about how these off-season decisions should go, why don't you pick up your phone, go to ultimate-gm.com, or you can just look up Ultimate Football GM on an app store and download that game. All right, that is an off-season, or it's a team running simulator. It's you got to do the draft, you have to do trades, you have to do contracts, you have to hire the right staff, and then see if your team wins all its games in the Super Bowl and becomes a dynasty. You can even you can draft a quarterback. He's your quarterback for 10 years, win 5 Super Bowls with him. He retires. He can become your coach and you can win 5 more Super Bowls with him. And you can take that as far into the future as you want. And now Locked On Vikings listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure you check it out today. Once again, just go to ultimate-gm.com or download it on the App Store, Ultimate Football GM. It is ultimate-gm.com or search out Ultimate Football GM on the App Stores. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Okay, let's talk about some salary cap stuff, because the 2 questions that I have gotten the most over the last 24-ish hours have been, A, what in the world is up with that restructure? How does that work? Did the Vikings just conjure money out of thin air? And B, where are they at with the cap? How can they be signing all these players? So let me try to reorient you a little bit on where they are at the cap, especially on the first day of the 2023 league year. Happy New Year, everybody. So there's a timeline to all of these things that matters. All of the signings that they have made, you will notice that when the team announces it, they use the phrase agreed to terms. They haven't actually signed that deal yet. You haven't actually brought somebody into the building to sign a contract, but you've agreed to everything. You've all shaken hands and all the negotiation is done, but you haven't officialized it because you can't, because the league year hasn't even turned over yet. And the Vikings may not have made the cap space for it yet, so they can just kind of sit there with this contract in their lap unsigned, and you wait for him to actually process the thing until you have done the other moves that make the cap space. Like, we're still waiting on Harrison Smith. We're still waiting on, I think that's the only pay cut thing. We're still waiting on Dalvin Cook trade news, if that is going to happen. Although Miami was one of the bigger suitors, apparently. I don't know what was real and what wasn't. But it sounded like Miami was one of them. They were the betting favorite, at least at one point, to get Dalvin Cook. But then they re-signed Jeff Wilson, so I'm assuming that fell down. So depending on whatever stuff happens there, right? But the big thing that gets the Vikings under the cap, and now we kind of know, okay, we've got these pay cuts like Chris Reed, Jordan Hicks, Ross Blacklock. They took their pay cuts. We don't know what's happening with Harrison Smith, but we've saved $16 million by restructuring Kirk Cousins. I'm going to tell you the functional way that this works, because it's way simpler. And then I'm going to go into why it works that way, which is way more complicated. But all you need to know is that the Vikings took $16 million of salary cap burden, and they moved it into next year. That will now hit next year as dead cap when Kirk Cousins' contract voids, aka ends, at on I think February 23rd of 2024. So February 23rd next year, Kirk Cousins becomes a free agent, and the Vikings will take on what is now $28.5 million in dead cap. In exchange, he costs just $20 million, I think like 20.75 or something. Against the cap this year. So just a $20 million cap hit for Kirk Cousins. It's one of the lower cap hits for a quarterback not on a rookie contract in the league. And Next year, 28.5. Dead cap, Cousins walks, and we just have to like eat a whole bunch of money. That is now how it works. That's all you need to know. If you followed that, you're good. If you want to know why it works that way, and they added a couple void years onto it and all that stuff, okay, what is the point of all of this? So you probably know, but if you don't, no worries, that signing bonus prorates. That means it divides evenly over every year in the contract. So when Kirk Cousins had 3 years in his contract, it had this year and then 2 void years on the end of it. If you had a $3 signing bonus, it would go from $3 that Cousins collects right now, but it would count against the cap as $1, $1, $1, right? So that's how it works. It divides and it has to be even. That's something that people didn't really get. Why would you add the void years? Because it divides evenly. The more years you add to the contract, the thinner that signing bonus spreads out. That's the point of the void years. So they took $20 million, which was his like roster bonus that was already guaranteed or whatever, $20 million, and they converted it into signing bonus, and then they added 2 years to the deal. So now it is a 5-year contract. 4 of those years are void, and Cousins won't actually be here. They're just kind of fake years for the purposes of accounting. It will divide up evenly into 4 million, 4 million, 4 million, 4 million, 4 million. If you didn't add the void years, it would divide up evenly into like 6.6 or whatever, 6.67 million in each of those years. So you are dividing it into chunks that are 2 million and change smaller. Now, what happens, this is not like baseball where you are paying a guy out for years and years and years after the deal. Once Kirk Cousins leaves, the second that contract voids, all of that prorated bonus money that's all stretched out into 5 years all accelerates and hits the 2024 cap. So you save money in 2023, but you could spread it after that. You could spread it, over 800 years and it wouldn't matter. You couldn't even do that anyways because it maxes out at 5. So this is the max spreading that the Vikings can do. Now, they could have converted more of his salary if they wanted to save even more money, but apparently this was sufficient. So they've chosen this amount, and this is the amount that they wanted to move. So everything that moves out of 2023 will spread out, but then by the time it's actually 2024, it will be paid out in 2024. And the only way to keep that from crunching together into a $28.5 million dead cap hit is to extend Kirk Cousins to more actual years where he plays for the Vikings. Then all of that prorated bonus will kind of stay in that structure. It won't accelerate and all kind of hit you in the face at once. But that is the point of this restructure. Functionally, all that void yearing and how much do we restructure 10 million or 20 million or 15 or all of it or maybe just $6 of it. All of that math is you're just deciding, okay, how much money do we want to save this year? And whatever we save this year is going into next year unless we extend him. All the void years are doing is allowing you to do that with a little bit more money. I hope that made sense to you. If not, if you need a visual example, because this is a podcast, there is I did a Beans video for this. All right, a short little explainer. It's on my Twitter page. You can also find it on the Locked On Vikings Twitter page. Again, functionally, they took 16 million and they moved it into next year. That is all this is. That's all you need to know about it. Everything else is just the guts of how it works for those who want to know more about that. The other functional thing is this really doesn't feel like something you do if you were planning to extend Kirk Cousins, does it? Here's the deal. If you extended Kirk Cousins, you probably give him, you would probably do something similar in terms of, whether you extend him for 1 year or 2 years or 4 years. You would probably use void years anyways to help keep it spread out. So you probably would do the same accounting as a part of a real extension as the Vikings just did now. And there's nothing in the world stopping them from, let's say the draft doesn't go the way they want, they don't get the quarterback they want, and they go, okay, Kirk, let's give you another year. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, from just saying, we're just going to give you money in 2024 and you can play for us as a quarterback, and agreeing to that, right? Nothing is stopping them from doing that. And I do think that that's still an option on the table. But both the reports that we have heard and the actions align with this, that I'm going to guess that is not the intention of the Vikings right now. And the draft would have to go poorly for them to do that with Kirk Cousins. I think that's where we're at. I think they're going to try. I really do. I think they're going to try to trade up and they're going to try to get a quarterback. That's not a guarantee. You can strike out. You can fail to get a partner. Somebody else could trade up in front of you. I think the biggest threat to this right now is the Commanders. They're sitting at 16, which means it's easier for them to trade up than it is for us. Whatever happens in the draft is impossible to predict. So if they strike out and they don't get the quarterback that they want in the draft, then I think they can go right down May 1st. They can go up to Kirk Cousins and say, hey, let's see if we can figure something out. And I would guess it sounds like they've been very transparent with Kirk Cousins about that. So I don't think that there's anything contentious there if that's what you're worried about. Again, I hope that made sense cap-wise. They have lowered his cap hit to push a little bit more money into next year, a lot of bit more money into next year. A little bit more than I'm personally comfortable with. I wouldn't have done that much, but I don't know the totality of their plan, so I'm sure that there's a reason it was that amount. And put off the idea of a Kirk Cousins extension until, at the very least, after the draft. But if not after the draft, then probably never. And he just walks in 2024 and the Vikings eat a big old dead cap hit. But that's how you got to get out of a contract like that. That's what you do when you pay a market rate quarterback a contract and you don't want to be like where the Browns are, where they're going to be paying $64 million a year to Deshaun Watson fully guaranteed for a bunch of years. Now that they've done a restructure, they're probably going to have to keep making that worse. That's quite a situation, but I don't have time to get into it. I will see you all tomorrow. We'll do a mailbag if nothing happens, but I think stuff's still going to keep happening. We're still waiting on Harrison Smith stuff. We're still waiting on a lot of contract deals with a lot of these deals. And I do want to go deeper into guys like Marcus Davenport and Byron Murphy. So that'll all come up this week, maybe next week. We're going to keep this going. I love you guys. See y'all tomorrow. And as always, Skull.